Good morning. We have the chance today to have with us Professor Atul Patak. Professor Atul Patak is the past president of the French Society of Hypertension, and he is the chief of the cardiology department of Princess Grace Hospital in Monaco. Happy to be that you are with us, Atul. We will be talking about atrial fibrillation and hypertension. These two diseases, atrial fibrillation and hypertension, are often associated diseases. Can you comment on this, please?
Yes, thank you, Roland, for having me on board. And I think from a public health point of view, it's important to state first that atrial fibrillation and hypertension are often associated, and even to share with the audience that hypertension is the first reason why people develop atrial fibrillation. We tend to forget it, but the best way to prevent atrial fibrillation is to control blood pressure. Now, why are these diseases associated? Because we know that from a pathophysiological perspective, the pressure pattern change within the heart, and especially in the atrium, induced by elevated blood pressure, could lead through some mechanical remodeling, but also through some electrical remodeling, to the phenomenon of inducing arrhythmia, and especially atrial fibrillation. Last but not least, we have to remind to the audience three very quick facts. Both diseases are silent diseases, which is, I think, a big challenge for the physician. Second, both diseases increase the risk of stroke independently, but also in an associated way. And last but not least, when you are able to detect these diseases, you are able to treat them, and by that reduce the burden of both, I would call risk factors for stroke.
Okay, thank you very much. So we understood that there is very strong association between these diseases and hypertension. It's a very important trigger of this. So should all hypertensive be systematically screened for atrial fibrillation, or do you have any patient profile or patient phenotype that we have to focus on?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, Roland. I think in the ideal world, you would love to screen for AFib in every single hypertensive patient, but the problem is the prevalence of the disease. If you just go back to, for example, French numbers, 14 million citizens are suffering from hypertension. And so you understand you cannot go to a massive screening. So basically, there are three ways to differentiate the strategy of screening. You could do what we call opportunistic screening. So you try to screen for AFib in patients who are having symptoms or who are having the chance to be in contact with healthcare providers. They see a nurse, they see a pharmacist, they see a doctor. Well, use this interaction to do the screening. You could use systematic screening, but as I told you, for this association, it's very complex because we are talking about around the world, 1.2 billion people suffering from hypertension. So I think this pattern is more dedicated to research. And finally, you could do, as you stated, screening maybe in more restricted groups. And this slide I'm sharing with you is somehow answering to your question. I think what could be these groups? How could you increase the quality of detection? One, you could be driven by age. The higher the age, the higher the chances to detect atrial fibrillation in hypertensive patient, starting from 65 and going up to above 75. Second, probably what I call metabolic comorbidities. Obese patient, diabetic patient are probably prone to develop atrial fibrillation. And finally, what I call the 3C, chronic heart failure, chronic kidney disease, and COPD. I think these three C diseases, these three chronic diseases are often associated with this pattern of hypertension, atrial fibrillation, and exacerbated risk of developing atrial fibrillation.
Very clear, very clear. So if we consider it, we have a huge number of patients that they are concerned by this screening or monitoring of blood pressure and atrial fibrillation. So if we decide to screen or to monitor, it doesn't matter the methods, opportunistic or systematic or focused one, do you have any methods or technique that you particularly recommend to be used in our daily practice?
Well, I would say there are lots of technology available, and you are familiar with that, Roland, from these tiny devices to more bulky devices, those devices which needs to be paired to devices directly showing you the signal. But I would state that when I have to decide for a device, I'm looking to at least 3 bullet points. First, something which can be used at home, which is an easy process to engage the patient and to be sure that they will do the screening process. They don't need to move. They can just do it right away when they're at home. Second, try to use a device where you can get as much information as possible. This is something we learned with the COVID crisis. So if I have a device in this particular case, which can measure blood pressure and measure heart rhythm and detect the ECG abnormalities, this is something which is a huge asset. For instance, the omron complete device or other devices have this approach. And even I would add something to this second bullet point is to directly see the signal. You don't need to pair the device with an iPhone. You don't need to get the signal sent on your computer. You can just directly read what's going on with your heart rate, with your ECG. And last but not least, I think it's shown here. I think that you need to also select a device which is compatible with the patient phenotype, but not the patient clinical phenotype, the patient digital phenotype. So we talked about the digital literacy. It should be easy to use. You just put your hands on something and it's measuring your ECG. You just put an armband or wristband without any complex connection procedure, and it's easy to measure your blood pressure. And last but not least, I think also something which is easy to use for this particularly subgroup of patients, elderly patient and patient with comorbidities.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is very clear. It has to be used at home with the standalone device, independent and easy to use. If the validation issue is something important for you?
Yeah, I mean, you need to go for a validated device. Otherwise, you are falling into the trap of using small, tiny items which are not appropriate for our patient. For example, you need to have a device where the quality of the signal is good enough to tell, well, this patient is having AFib, and you're not having something which is just a blood pressure signal which has been extracted and not appropriately monitored. So the quality of the data, the validation of the data, the validation process is a key component, and also the trust you have in some companies which are known to offer quality in the signal, quality in the device, quality in the post-processing. So yeah, you're absolutely right. You need to go for validated devices. These devices which are validated, their list is available on some specific sites, whether sites from national societies, the European Society for Hypertension or the European Society for Cardiology, or in some also references as the one cited here on these figures, which is the consensus paper published jointly by the ERA and the ESC. So there are multiple ways to see which device to select, which one has been validated and has been established as quality, excellence, and standard of care.
Thank you very much, Atul, for these important messages. We understood that atrial fibrillation and hypertension are associated, and that we have to go to screen this patient, a different method of screening, and we have to do it using simple and validated devices. Thank you very much for being with us, and see you later.
Thank you, Roland.